Thank you all for attending this program tonight. I'm Jen Noble. I'm the Adult and Teen Services Librarian here at the Adrian District Library. With me, we've got Bruce Neal from the Lenawee Historical Society. He is going to be talking about all the cars that were manufactured here in Adrian throughout time. There should be some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourselves then, but do remember that we are recording this. If you're uncomfortable with that, just type it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that throughout the evening, as well as sharing my screen so you can see some images of these cars, the factories, all of that kind of thing. With that, I'm going to mute myself, turn off my video, and just turn it over to Bruce here.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bruce Neal, and thanks for coming to Adrian Automotive History. Our story starts in 1901. In Adrian, a company called Church Manufacturing Company, general manager was the name of Walter Clement. Mr. Clement got kind of swept up in the times with a desire to have a new car, one of the newfangled horseless carriages, you might say. Well, Church Manufacturing Company was probably as well-versed as anywhere in the area to do a car because they had a history of making gasoline engines. As you can see on your screen, a picture of the sort of hit and miss type engines you might see at farm shows and such nowadays. It was liquid cooled, large flywheel, single cylinder, slow RPM, but they used them around farms at the time quite a bit. Now, when Mr. Clement got interested in an automobile, he decided to go ahead and order one. He talked a couple places and ended up going to Detroit to get the car. And it turned out to be an Oldsmobile. They called a curved dash Oldsmobile. That was one of the most common cars at the time. So in 1901, he got a ride, or I believe he took the train probably up to Detroit, took delivery of the car, and decided he'd be driving it home to Adrian. So on his way home, he met one other car in Ypsilanti area, I understand. And on his way, going about maybe 20 miles an hour max, it suddenly stopped running. So there he was. And so he found a local farmer and they pulled him over and put it away in the barn, kept it, and he got a ride on the train and on home. Well, that was pretty disappointing, as you can imagine. So his words were, well, heck, my company can make a better car than that. So that really got him interested in the ability to make a car here in Adrian. So he hired a designer and a gentleman named Willis Murray to help also with the design. And understand that Mr. Murray invested in the company, so they decided to use his name, Murray, for the name of the car. So they ordered materials for 300 cars here in late 1901, and that required them to spend $60,000. So they had to take out a large loan for that, which was a huge amount of money, certainly optimistic for 300 cars. So the first cars were ready in late 1901 to 1902. And you can see in the picture, this is one of the very earliest models. It was a single cylinder, 5 horsepower, liquid cooled, do 20 to 25 miles an hour. Now, the one in the picture, you can see the back of it is where the engine was, and it was kind of squared off, pretty crude. And certainly the styling of it, if you can call it that, was looked like a buggy without the horse, hence the horseless buggy terms. It also It didn't have a steering wheel. It had a tiller bar, push pull to steer it. As they got the first cars ready, they worked pretty well in testing and they felt pretty confident. So they took the first couple of cars to the Chicago Auto Show, very first auto show. And that was one of the top two, along with New York, places to demo your new cars and show them to people. So the next picture you'll see was more of a production model. And there we go. This is one which got a little more stylish. You can see the cover on the back has a slope and a little bit of a fin on it. You can see the big chain drive in the back had a big sprocket there. And again, it sat quite a ways up in the air, so it took a little effort to climb up into it, but just had one seat, and it was pretty small type thing. So still very reminiscent of a buggy. Okay, and they had the car pretty much ready, and when they started to make a few models at the factory, you'll see that there was a number of workers there at the factory. And I think we have a picture there. We go. And it's over on East Church Street. This is, you can see a car or two there and quite a few of the workers lined up. Now, they ended up getting in 1902 about 50 workers. And this looks like that collection of that group of employees. The building was the same building. It wasn't really enlarged, and they were quite known as the machine shop. So they had the equipment to build most of the parts they needed. But they also had to use suppliers for parts too. And that was what caused a number of problems to get the first cars out. They were behind schedule. And after the show,
Again, it up as high as it goes.
The Chicago show, they had would have sold 100 cars. The person at the show, manning the show, said if they had had them. But again, they were took a while to get in production, and really the first cars probably of any quantity, and that means 3 or 4 weren't ready till March and April. So they were starting to deliver some of the cars and get production up, and it did in a little bit towards the summer. Now, this is a picture in 1902. This was later in the year, but this was a high point for the company. It was the use by the U.S. Postal Service of a Lion car to deliver the mail. And they used, I think, more than one car. And around Adrian, it was the first rural mail route delivered by automobile in the United States. It was a test, and they found that they could deliver the mail in half the time versus a horse and carriage. And it was quite successful, even in wintertime. If you look closely at the rear, you'll see the earliest of tire chains on the rear wheel to help gain traction. But as it turned out, the car would be quite a bit more expensive than the horse and carriage, and the post office wasn't quite ready to do that yet and spend that kind of money. So even though it was deemed to be successful, they didn't go forth with it. So still into 1903 production, and it reached as many as 100 to 200 cars. I've heard 130 some, another count. Well, they totaled up their costs of production so far on the cars, and they literally found out they were losing money on every one of them. So the company decided that they needed to get a lot more efficient, but the problem was that they didn't attract investors because at the time, banks or people that wanted to put money on a project were fearful of automobiles and very skeptical. So it wasn't a thing that people were willing to put their money into. And that was the problem of the Murray, was they didn't gear up for mass production. And they built all the parts that they did and bought mostly were made one by one. They used like drill presses and such to make parts and cut them out rather than gearing in production means such as stamping or others that requires a large investment initially, but you can produce the parts much cheaper. So here they are in 1903 and decided that they would halt production because it was not a money-making venture. So we found out that as far as the Murrays went with that 130, as many as 4 to 6 still exist. Now that was about 30 some years ago. I looked at the count. So that's a pretty good survival rate. But I don't know today where they all are, but I probably need to do an update on that and find out some more. So we move on, and every year in England, they have a what they call a race there for old cars pre-1905. Now, this is not really a race. It's kind of like a rally. London to Brighton, it's called, and it's about 60 miles. And they end up with at least 400 cars pre-1905. The Brits are really into old cars. And one of the participants here was Murray, came from, I'm not sure just where that one came from, but it was there in London. And as you can see, the two people that were manning it, it's in November they have this. So they're pretty bundled up because it's pretty cold. And Murray's had no heater, but it was chugging right along. And the Murray participated with the Murray and several times in it. I know not every time did it finish. And on several of the cars, of course, don't finish the 60-mile run. And this is another Murray here. This one was in London too. And I don't know what its stature in the race was, but they had a pretty good record there. The Murrays running in the London to Brighton run. The other Murray we have is a picture of the Murray. There it is. That's the Murray that's in the Lenawee Historical Museum. We got a lot of other pictures and items setting on it, but they did have a little different wheels from time to time. Sometimes they used wood wheels, sometimes they used spoke wheels, and sometimes they got changed a little later to bicycle wheels because one of the problems is that tires for the earliest sizes weren't always available. But you can see this one in the museum, the engine cover in the back is propped open. That's why it looks up in the air there. But that's Murray that was originally restored here in Adrian. And this was owned by the Clement family, Walter Clement's descendants for many, many years. Matter of fact, it's still owned by them. It's on extended loan, actually, the museum. So there's the Murray. So that was going to be the end of manufacturing of cars, maybe, but it wasn't over for church manufacturing. In the meantime, in 1903, they had an idea for an improved, better car, figured maybe they'd learned something from the Murray, and they were ready to move on to a larger and better car. So I have a picture of the Murray that's located at the Imperial Palace Automotive Collection in Las Vegas. Now, see the 1903 Lenaway? I remember being out there in 1999 and seeing this car. It's their collection at the Imperial Palace, 5th floor. had a lot of cars on display, and many of them were also for sale. So the Lenaway, excuse me, for sale, I was pretty impressed to see that from Lenawee County. And it had all been restored, just beautiful car. And I think the price on it was $15,000. Now, I don't remember for sure, but that was a pretty healthy price tag 20 some years ago. But you can see the Lenaway has optional wicker side bags or boxes on it for storage. The Lenaway was a little larger car. The price on the sign there at the Imperial Palace, I believe, said $1,475 when it sold for new. So that was quite a bump up from the $650 of the Murray. Maybe they hoped to make a little money on it at that price. But it was 8 horsepower instead of 5 horsepower in the Murray. Had a steering wheel, you can see, instead of the tiller bar. Improved cooling, the front radiator. So a number of things were done better on the Lenaway. Now, the Imperial Palace Car was ultimately sold to a gentleman in San Francisco. And the picture you see now is the same car. Imperial Palace had taken it out to around Las Vegas. You can tell by the terrain it's in that area. And they did a photo of it for a calendar, and it appeared in a Imperial Palace calendar. It's a pretty spiffy looking car, I'd say. But and when I saw it, it was really a nice restoration job. And I'm not sure who or where that was done, but it was, as it appeared at the Imperial Palace, it was in restored condition. The gentleman that bought it from San Francisco, I know he was in the export business and knew how to export a car to London. So he took it to London to run it in the London to Brighton old car race. And there it is in London with the wicker baskets and all. And then I think we've got another picture of it showing it competing in the race. There we go. And that's him and I believe his wife riding snugly bundled up in the November event. Now, he did this a number of times from about 2001 to on for several years, ran it in the London to Brighton race. And it finished, I mean, numerous times. So to make that 60-mile run and finish when some of the cars didn't, and there were cars from all over Europe and such there too, earliest before 1905. So that's quite a record. So we can be proud of our Lenawee car doing so well. So by 1903, they had made some Lenaways later in 1903, but only about a dozen were made. Some say maybe as many as 50, we're not sure, but I think more than a dozen probably was it. And at that time, it just got too expensive to manufacture. And they found out again, they weren't making any money on it. And despite the fact that Walter Clement had bought all the company stock up trying to save the company, he couldn't do it. And with that $60,000 debt hanging over him still to be paid, the company folded towards the end of 1903. And here's a picture of a Lenawee with Walter Clement driving it later in his years. Walter Clement was involved with a number of companies around Adrian, including the Page Fence Company in his years, and knew a lot of businessmen and knew most of them around town. And here he is in one of his later years. He lived till 1928. So I don't know how late this picture was. It's with his wife, daughter, and I might be sister there. But he's still driving a Lenawee. So good for him. So that was pretty much the end of manufacturing cars in Adrian until 19 1907. And that I was telling you that we had 3 cars maybe made in Adrian. Well, there's really a 4th one from Adrian, but it never really went anywhere. And that car was the Page Adrian. This was to be made by the Page Fence Company, who at that time was a very successful manufacturer of woven wire fence. Well, Adrian was the fence capital of the world at the time, and a number of manufacturers in Adrian produced wire fence, miles of fence a day, most successful being the Page Company. Well, J. Wallace Page was head of the company, and his son was Homer Page, and Homer had the idea of building an automobile, and they couldn't use the name Page because there was a Page car out east in Massachusetts, and there was a Page in Detroit spelled with an I, so they had to call it Page Adrian. They did in 1907 build at least a couple of prototypes, and by this ad, it says it was a 4-cylinder, 2-cycle air-cooled motor. 2-cycle and air-cooled probably be kind of unusual, but that's what they had. And they weren't afraid to boast on it, what you've been looking for and such. So, and it says in a light but strong, racy looking car. So they did have 2 of them that were on the streets of Adrian. I don't know how well they worked, but if we got another picture, here it is. The Page Adrian, they went as far as to have advertising. You can see the price on there, maybe. It's kind of small, but $2,400. Now, previously, the Lenaway was just $1,400 at most. So this was pretty pricey for 1907, 1908. And they said also, again, the 2-cycle engine, air or water cooled, kind of unusual, 35 horsepower. So who knows? Well, I don't know whatever happened to that. I heard nothing more, just that the 2 prototypes were made, and people thought with the Page financial success behind it, might go somewhere, but for whatever reason, and maybe I'll have to do more research and learn why, but it never came to pass. So here we are, 1908. But we've got another adventure starting in 1908, and that would be the Lion Car. All right, what happened then? 1908, we have a company from Detroit that acquired the rights from a car called the gyroscope. Now, I don't know if there was ever any gyroscope cars made, but apparently there was a design for it. And here you can see the chassis in front of you, gyroscope car. The gentleman acquired the patent for it. Some of the details are a little bit strange. It had a horizontal flywheel. That meant the crank was vertical and the flywheel was on the bottom of the engine. And supposedly with the flywheel going around the bottom meant that it would prevent skidding. Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, they got the rights to the car, and they thought and started to raise money and such in Detroit. But as it turned out, their names were Fred Postal and Henry Bowen. Well, turns out that Mr. Bowen was from Adrian. Aha, there's the connection. And Mr. Bowen decided that they should come down to Adrian and look for a place to build their car. So down to Adrian they came, and then they found available the Lion Fence Company building. Now, the Lion Fence Company had merged with another fence company, and the building was available, so they got the rights to the building. And guess what? Since it had lion fence on it, they wouldn't have to paint lion on there again. Well, they might have anyway, but So it became the Lion Motor Company. So that's how the car was named. They took the name from the Lion Fence Company. So the location of the factory was on Logan Street. Now, the part of the same building is still there to this day, and that's being used by the Burdick Cabinet Companies right by the railroad track on Lion Street, just off of Division Street. So they needed the factory made ready to make automobiles because before it made fence. So here's what they did. They asked for the local people to contribute money to convert the factory. They were going to need about $15,000 to convert the factory. And they had a local meeting, and it was going to be at the chamber, the city chambers, but so many people wanted to come, they moved it to the Croswell. This was in 1909. And in that meeting, they said they needed $15,000. Well, that evening, they got $4,000, people wanting to help bring that car company to Adrian. And then within 6 weeks, they had raised $2,500 over the $15,000 they needed to convert the factory. So that was a lot of enthusiasm from Adrian residents. Well, they did it, and they started converting the factory and went right to that. And then during 1909, they worked on getting the prototype cars, initial cars ready. Now, what they ended up doing was they did not use the engine that the gyroscope had proposed, and I'm kind of glad they didn't. They got a more conventional engine and put that in it. And then other parts they acquired from other sources. Now, the Lion's what was known as an assembled car. That means that they bought parts and components from other manufacturers, like the engine, transmission, rear end, the frame, in this case, the body. Quite a few of the parts were bought, and they merely at the plant assembled the parts into finished cars. So if you bought pretty good components from reliable suppliers, you could probably come out with a pretty good car at the time. So they got the cars ready, and then by January 2010, and this was in wintertime, they were out driving a couple Lion early prototypes out on the streets, and apparently they worked very well. The engine was pretty powerful, 40 horsepower, liquid cooled. Now, the picture that we just saw up was an early Lion. That was the Roadster. The one that you're looking at right now was a touring car. The Roadster had one seat. The touring car was probably the most popular. That has the back seat. The cars were about 3,100 pounds. The price was to be about $1,600. These were considered an upper medium price car, kind of like a Buick might be today. They had pretty large wheels and such. What you're looking at now is a Lion Speedster, which in 1911 they offered. That was called the Gentleman's Speedster. This one did not have a windshield or a top. It was lighter, and it was kind of the sports car of the trio. But you can see it's kind of racy looking. I kind of like it. So after getting the prototypes out, the people in Adrian, you got to understand, they were really enthused about a car being made in Adrian. And the Lion was by far the most valiant effort to do that. So what they did at the factory, they had several of them ready now. And in February 2nd, 1910, they had a big gala party at the Lion factory. And all of Adrian was invited. And despite being a rainy, icy evening, 7 o'clock, 3,000 to 4,000 Adrianites showed up at the party at the factory, where they had 3 new Lions on display. One of them, an ivory color, is really an eye catcher. And they had the Imperial Band from Adrian there playing in a room reserved just for dancing. So I guess it was quite a party with Adrian folks celebrating the new cars. and everybody enjoyed it, and it was a great event. Well, they did have that, and then the next day, the 3 lions were put on a train car and shipped to Chicago for the Chicago Auto Show, where they will be introduced to the public. Well, they got them there to Chicago, and again, they were very well received. Again, if they'd had them available, they probably could have sold them. It's like any stunning new car, you could sell them all the first day. But they did well there at the show and came home. The Lion has a 40-horse engine, I told you. It's a great big engine. It's 318 cubic inches. I think we've got a picture of the Lion engine next. There it is. It's a monster engine. But we at the museum, we do turn it over from time to time, and you'd think with a crank that'd be a monster to start, but fact is it isn't, because it's only got a 4-to-1 compression ratio, and an engine that size only getting 40 horsepower because the fuel at the time was not very good, and it would have detonated if you would have tried to add a higher compression. So it's a big engine, but 40 horsepower, but it was a fairly competitive engine for the time. It has external valve gear that you can see kind of in front of you. Those activated the exhaust valves, and the intakes were in the head. So you can see the 4 spark plugs and all there. So the Lion engine that they bought, I'm not sure they got that from, I've heard 2 places, Michigan Foundry and another from Continental Engine Company. I'm not sure where exactly it came from, but I do know at one time they put an order in for 400 engines. So that was pretty significant. So January 1910, Lions were on the streets, had them sent to the show. We have a couple of ads that came out after the Chicago show. And there we go, the measure of the Lion 40. It's too small to see that, but they got a number of statements there of how great the Lion is, and how much goodness you can see there. They weren't afraid to make good advertising and boast the utility and how great their car was. Well, I guess that's what you do in advertising. And then next ad, the Lion 40 starts from the seat. Well, this was well before electric motor starter motors didn't come in till 15, 16, somewhere there. So the Lion in 1910, they had little petcocks on the engine where you could put some fuel in, and you would ground the magneto, stop the engine when you quit running. But you had to get out and maybe crank it over a part of a turn, not start it, get the piston at the right spot. And when you go back and get in the car, you could reconnect the magneto, put power to it, and fire that cylinder that was ready to fire and start it up. So, it wasn't cranking it, but it was pretty, in a way, kind of inconvenient. But they could argue it starts from the seat. So that's the claim to fame there. So the next thing we have is some of the Lion marketing was the Detroit sales office. This was a showroom, Detroit, where they could sell cars. I think you can see on the side of the building, Lion cars. So they did have other marketing employees to go. And the factory started with around 70 employees, I think. On the next picture, there we go. That's at the Lion factory. All the happy employees out there lining up for a nice picture. Ultimately, the employment got up to 200, and then close in 1912, close to 300 employees assembling Lions. So it was a pretty successful company. Cars were being turned out during this time frame. because they didn't do a lot of manufacturing of parts, they just assembled them. The problem was getting the parts from suppliers. But once they could get the parts, they didn't have a lot of problem putting them together. One of the things that they wanted to work on during the time frame was making another Lion that they could increase volume with, and that was to be the Lion 30. This was to be a smaller, cheaper car, cost just under $1,000, and they had some prototypes during 1911-12 time they developed, and 30 horsepower, and they did have 2 prototypes ultimately they produced by 1912. So that was one of the future plans, big plans in 1912 on increasing production and on into 1913. So 10, 11, 12 cars were produced. Each year, some of the components changed or got a little bit better as suppliers had better offerings. So the 1912 Lion was a little bit different than the 1910, little improvements and such. So things were going along quite well, making money and all, until the fateful night of June 2nd, 1912, when there was a massive fire at the factory. As you can see, the picture of the factory on the top, there's some of the fire actually burning. It was complete and totally destructive. On the bottom, some of the factory, there's just piles of cars and metal there. Everything was destroyed. There wasn't any roof or ceiling left, and everything in the side burned. Now, it was largely a wood building. You had a lot of solvents around for paint and fuels. And what they believe might have happened was the lights on one of the car would somehow leak, because they did use acetylene in lights. And somehow that leaked and caught fire. And with the solvents in a wood building, it just would take right off. It wasn't any problem to imagine that. This is a picture of what's left of the factory. You could see some of the concrete or the wood brick or walls there, but that was about it. No roof, none of the structure above left. And there was just piles of metal. There was 150 cars in various stages of assembly destroyed in the fire. And that was a huge loss. Estimated the loss of the factory in cars was 350,000, maybe 400,000. They only had insurance for half that, 180,000. Just a few months before, the management turned down increasing the insurance to 80% of value, because the thought was, well, the whole plant could never burn. Oh, I wish they had a second thought on that. But it was a terrible loss. And it was one of the fire chiefs from Adrian Fire Department lost his life. His last name was Schoen, when the wall fell on him. So it was a loss of life also. So it was a very tragic fire, and people were very saddened in Adrian, of course. Well, the company started making plans for an alternate location and wanted to go and get started again, especially with their thoughts, the Lion prototypes of the Lion 30 that sadly were destroyed in the fire. 2 prototype cars lost. So they wanted to get these going, as well as a new location. And they asked the city, the residents of Adrian, to help them with funding for a stock offering. They needed $10,000 to arrange the stock offering. In a matter of days, the Adrian residents came up with the money, so they were able to have a stock offering. But at the time, the stock offering languished, and over a period of about 6 months, the stock offering was deemed to be a failure. Why, I'm not sure, but apparently there was a lot of competition in the auto industry at that time. And that ended up being the end of the Lion Company because of the failed stock offering. Well, that pretty well did it for the Lion Company. And then we move on to the Lion car that's in the Lenawee Historical Museum. This is a picture of that. You might ask, how did the Lion car that's in the museum get here? Well, that's a long story. So let's see if we can cover it kind of quickly in the time. The car goes, we have to go with the story, not the car, but we have to go to the story to Australia. And a gentleman named Bruce Wright, he liked old cars, and he heard of a abandoned car 1,000 miles from his Brisbane, Australia home in the outback. And so he got interested in it and learned something about it and took off for those 1,000-mile trip and ended up going with a local bushman fellow who took care of the fences there to protect against the wildlife. Australia maintained these fences, and he knew the backcountry around his area. So that's where the car was. And it had been abandoned there. Somebody was homesteading or whatever. It had been there for many, many years. And all it was is kind of what you see in front of you. The frame, the engine, maybe the rear end and steering column. And this is a picture of what he got a little later when he was starting to restore it, because it shows up so much better. But it didn't look as nice and clean and attractive as it is here. But he loaded in his trailer and took it on home. So he didn't know what he had. He didn't know what it was. There was no identification, but he was familiar enough with old cars to realize that it was American. Well, this was in 1974, okay? 1976, he received a letter from the bushman that helped him, who said he was talking to a local at a restaurant out in the bush area where the car was. And he said he remembered a radiator on it with a round badge that said Lion. Well, that was the key he needed, because when the Bruce Wright got the car, there was no radiator on it. Somebody had taken that for another use. So when he heard about Lion, he wrote to the Antique Automobile Club of America in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and asked them if they knew about a Lion car made in America. Well, yes, they did. It was made in Adrian, Michigan, 1910 to 1912. And it was only those 3 years that it was manufactured. So he got that information, Bruce Wright did, in Australia, and had his car identified as to what brand it was. So then he wrote to Adrian, I think he wrote to the Daily Telegram, and asked him if anybody knew about the Lion car in Adrian. Well, Telegram sent the letter over to the Historical Museum here, where Dr. Charles Lindquist was curator at the time, and he dug up quite a bit of information for him about the Lion factory in operation and sent that to Australia. So the connection with Adrian and the Australian Lion was made. So with that, it wasn't until about 1978 that Bruce Wright got a letter from the Antique Automobile Club. He'd made a number of contacts there, and they said that a Lion was for sale in Rapid City, South Dakota, and would you be interested in it? And Bruce Wright said, well, yes, I would. I'd like to have that car. And it was for sale at the Horseless Carriage Museum, a museum that also will sell some of their cars too. So how did a Lion get to Rapid City, South Dakota? Well, in this picture, you'll see a gentleman. His name is C.A. Springsteen. After World War I, he homesteaded in Wyoming. He took a Lion car from the Midwest and drove it out there and homesteaded in a town just west of Casper, Wyoming, on 22,000 acres, quite a spread for his ranch. Well, he kept the car for 20, 30 years until after World War II, and then ended up selling it to the Horseless Carriage Museum at Rapid City. So that's the gentleman that took it out west and ultimately got it to the museum in Rapid City. Well, there in the meantime, Bruce Wright decided that he'd like to buy the Lion, and it was offered for $8,500 at Rapid City, but it was going to cost $6,000 or so to ship it to Australia, and that was more than he wanted to spend. So he wrote Adrian and said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if somebody from Adrian could get this car in Rapid City and bring it home to Adrian? Well, Charles Lindquist kind of shared that with Roger Wyatt, who ran a drugstore in Adrian and always kind of supported some historical articles in the Telegram back in the 70s. And he passed it to his friend, Bill Saunders. Bill Saunders owned Lenaway Electric Company and kind of liked old cars. And was he interested in the Lion? He said, oh boy, yes, I was. So he called this gentleman he knew from his electrical contractors association in Rapid City and had him go look at the car and check it out. He did, and contacted him back, said it was all complete there. Wasn't running though. So, well, that sparked Bill Saunders' interest here in Adrian. So he got in an airplane and flew on out to Rapid City, and then checked out the car and ended up buying it for $8,000. This was in 1979. And then he got a U-Haul truck and then put the Lion in it and drove it home. But he had kind of a sense of humor, so he had a sign made up, danger, Lion inside, and he had that on the U-Haul truck. So he had a little bit of adventure of being stopped a time or two. Hey, you can't carry a Lion in a truck like that. Oh no, it's a safe Lion. So he had a good time with it on the way back on the long trip back to Adrian with the Lion. I thought that was kind of neat. So Bill Saunders unloaded his Lion and started on the work of getting it running. That was his first thing. The engine was froze, stuck. It wouldn't even turn over. So he had to make a way to pound the pistons loose. And it was a pretty strenuous job in getting it freed up, which he did. But they had all kinds of problem getting it to fire. It's got a magneto. As it turned out, they couldn't make it fire. And they found out that it was the wrong magneto. So he had to order a Fairbanks Morris magneto and then get a new one, got it on there, and eventually fired it instead of number 1 cylinder, did it off a number 3 cylinder, and bang, it started and fired. And well, what a day that was. So they got it sort of running. And that was a glorious time here. This was on into 1980. So with the Lion running, and it was time to restore it. So he had to do painting and replace wood parts and a number of other things. Some things that I think the back fenders were missing. So he had to have a replica made, and tires, the wheels had been replaced later on. They're still wood wheels, but the early ones, tires weren't available in that size. So it's not perfect, but it's fairly original. So anyway, got the Lion running and presentable, and it's a roadster model, has 1 seat in it. It's the 40 horsepower, and it's a 1912 model. That was the last year. So he used it a number of times and displayed it in Adrian, used it and ran it in parades over 20 years, and had a great time with it. Then came time in 2001 that he wanted to share it with all of the Lenaway and Adrian community. So he decided the thing to do would be to give it to the Lenawee Historical Museum, which he did, and then contracted with the local antique automobile club to take it all apart, which they did, and put it all back together in the museum, because the museum just has doors and there's no way you could get it in otherwise. So it was taken down to the engine and the frame and reassembled in its present location at the museum. So that lion was originally from South Dakota, but it's not Australia. And in the meantime, the Australian lion, Bruce Wright, wanted to restore it. And if we got a picture of that, there we go. Bruce started restoring it, and you can see the radiator. That radiator he put on there, he had to order that from America somewhere. It was actually not off of a Lion, it was off of a Oakland, which was made in Michigan, and it had to have a hole in it, you can see, for the crank. But it was practically the same shape and size. And he told me it was $500 plus shipping. So that was a sight unseen type of investment, but got to have it. So Bruce worked on restoring the car. This is the front, and here's the seat and some of the radiator, wood wheels, axle in the back. He redid. He had to do gears, build some gears for the transmission that were broken. I think axle broken. Then get a steering wheel. I think he had the steering column as such. Well, he built a seat, you can see there, out of wood. So he had a pretty good job restoring it. And then finally, here it is. Bruce Wright told me he had to find somebody to build the body. So he decided to build it as a Speedster, because you didn't need to put a top on it or have a windshield, so it'd be simpler. And he would be out driving it anyway, only on nice days. So here it is coming out of the body shop. It was a chore, he said, to find a bodybuilder that didn't think he was a millionaire, so he could get it built for maybe a reasonable price, if that's possible. But it was quite an effort to build that. And I know it was a great day when it came out of the shop for him. And this was probably about 2012 or so when the body was done. So there it is in Australia. So that's the #2 Lion. And it's at home still in Australia. Now this is Bruce Wright. He came to America here on a trip, and they went through America and touring the great cities of Boston, New York City, San Francisco, and Adrian. What a sight. We were up there with the 3 big cities in Adrian, and Bruce Wright and his wife Val were here for a couple days in 2011. We showed them all around and had a great time. They're just wonderful people. Here's Bruce setting in our Lion. And I mean, there were tears in his eyes. He was just so emotional being here, because over the couple of years beforehand, he would write or email here at the museum about the Lion and ask questions. And I would email him back with what I had on the car and make sketches and such. So it was important to have the Lion here to help him restore his. So there we are. We're just glad to tell you about the 3 and the 4th car made in Adrian. I have, if you want to learn more, booklets here. This is called Seeds of Time on the Adrian Lion. We have these available for sale at the museum. Also a second book like this, but called The Lion Tamers, like the Lion Tamers on my cap. This also tells about the Australian lion. Those are available for $2.50 each at the museum. And another great book that was done on the Murray and the Lenaway. This is Automotive Quarterly. It's a high-end automotive book. And in 2006, Two, there was a article about Walter Clement and his grand automotive adventure. And it's just a wonderful story in here on this book that Beverly Ray Kim's a premier automotive writer did about the Lion. So I really can't show you much. There's Walter Clement and the same picture I had showed you about the Lenaway. So this is a great article in here about the Adrian Lion and the Murray. And it also goes quite a bit into the London to Brighton race pictures. And also, we have this book available at the museum. We have a copy available that you can look at the museum if you want to read the article. We don't have it for sale, but you can look at it there. So if you do want to see the Murray and the Lion, which we have at the museum, come to the museum Fridays and Saturdays at 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., 2 days a week. And you could see both cars there sitting there for your inspection. And the admission is free. So we're looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much for listening in on Adrian's automotive history. There's a lot more research you can do at the library. We have scrapbooks and articles about all the three and the fourth car available at the museum for your looking at. So thank you very much.
Thank you for doing this presentation, Bruce. This was fascinating. I know I learned a ton just from listening to this. There is a little time for questions. Type them in the chat if you want to, or unmute yourselves and just ask them out loud. If you put them in the chat, I will read them to Bruce so he can answer them. As we are waiting, I will also say, yes, please do see the Time Museum if you have the cash. But if you are on a budget right now, the library has copies too. Okay, April also says, thank you. This was very interesting. She's excited to watch the video. Another thank you from Barbara. Oh, Nick, go ahead.
Chuck? Oh.
Did you ask a question, Nick? You might have cut out there. Nick, are you able to type your question? I'm sorry, but you are cutting in and out. We can't actually hear you.
Lion car. It had cast aluminum crankcases.
Yeah, that's correct.
April also says she's taken almost all of her grandchildren to the museum and they've all enjoyed their visit. All right. Since it doesn't look like anyone has any questions, we will just end the presentation a couple minutes early. If you do have questions, email me, call the library, call Bruce at the museum. We are happy to discuss this presentation, other historical things for Lenawee County, Adrian, all of that kind of thing, anytime. So with that, I hope you all have an excellent rest of your evening.